This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam peoples.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is April 17th, 2025.
I'm Scott Delunderbaum.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, the debate became the story rather than the actual debate, which sucked.
Yeah, no, you had a choice moment on this one. So we're recording this about 2 hours after the debate wrapped, so it'll all be fairly fresh takes tonight.
Yep, my favorite kind of takes. Get the even hotter takes in our patron Slack, where we had a nice flowing live stream, patreon.com/politicos. Let's start with the story of the debate. We were joking in the Slack that I can't remember a debate that people universally praised. There were some that were like, that was fine, or like there were some good moments. But in terms of like structure and stuff, there's always something awkward about it. It's just hard to get 4 to 5 people on stage and it all to go smoothly.
Yeah, or at least in the last few debates. I seem to remember quite liking the one that Paul Wells moderated back in 2015. That was also a weird election because it was 3 months long, which was a absolute slog to get through. So glad we're just
opposite of this one.
Yeah, so glad we're just doing 36 days on this. Yeah, but that campaign had some good debates. They had a foreign policy specific one, which was actually kind of nice. Like, yeah, nobody in Canada votes on foreign policy except like 5 people. But it was actually just kind of nice to have like a debate on a narrower topic where they could just spend the time diving into that. If you could have had a couple of those this election, that would have been ideal, at least from my perspective. But instead, we got the debate commission debates. This is something the Liberal government set up sometime after 2015. I don't have the exact date in front of me, but it's basically been in effect the last couple of elections, and neither of us should remember anyone ever saying a positive thing about that, except maybe Trudeau or their, would it be Heritage Minister, I guess, at the time, defending it in kind of a somewhat half-hearted way. But, nobody's ever come out with a great review of a debate the debate commission's put together, and this year sure seems like no exception.
Yeah, some of the past debates, I can't remember which one. There was one that had like 4 moderators, and that was bad.
I think that was last just elections.
Maybe one of the last 2, I think. It's just not been exciting. This year's had Steve Paikin moderate, and I went back and he moderated the 2006 debate, which was the last time there wasn't a woman on stage. I think he also did 2008. So we're just
done a lot of
going
these.
Back to the same well.
Pretty sure he did 2015 too.
He didn't do well tonight, I thought.
Yeah, it was really weird. So the way it was structured was each section, there would be a question directed at each of the leaders. They would answer it, and then there would be the start of an open discussion section where anyone could talk. But
notably, each leader got asked a different question, supposedly in the same category, but one category was just leadership.
Yeah, and it was weird, particularly because for some reason, they were not all the same question to each candidate. They were all over the place.
They were different difficulties. Like the Liberal and Conservatives got questions that actually kind of grilled them. The NDP questions were like, so people have talked about cutting the GST. Would you cut the GST? Just like, tell us about what's in your platform.
Yeah, it was the softest of balls lobbed towards the NDP. And much more pointed questions at particularly the Conservatives, but also the Liberals.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
they had a weird they had a weird clock on the edge showing how much speaking time each had used. So at the end, you could be like, oh, Carney's spoken for like 5 more minutes than everyone else, except Polyev, who he talked for like 30 seconds more. It was weird to just see that like direct comparison without any effort to do anything about that. Like, if we're having the comparison, have them talk the same amount of time. Or just don't show us the comparison and don't make me mad about something that doesn't matter.
The Blanchet was the only one that actually jumped in with what my time is on that clock.
He was definitely the shortest.
Yeah,
he and the NDP were both pretty low.
Yeah, but was the clock running every time Singh jumped in to interrupt someone or try and shout over them? Which was the other weird thing tonight was, if I had asked you 2 days ago, who would be the person on stage who would be doing the most interrupting and yelling, I'm pretty sure you would have said Polyev.
Yeah, I might have given Singh as a runner-up. But we'll come back into the specific performances. I want to zoom back out to the meta question because, my God, there were stories even before the first debate happened. First, we were told the Greens would be in. The commission exists because there were so many debates between 2006 and 2015 about who should be in, and it was kind of just up to random media, and depending on the consortium or who worked together, it was all arbitrary. And that frustrated mostly the Greens, but also the Liberals wanted some consistency. And so I got the impetus for the commission. And they set out 3 rules that seemed reasonable enough. You had to be polling above 4% 28 days before the election date. You had to have a sitting MP, and you had to have at least 90% of constituencies having a candidate. Yeah, you had to meet 2 of 3 of those.
Yeah, and just on the MP one, it was an MP elected as a member of the party. So, like, you couldn't count Flora Cross.
That's been a thing the Greens have used before.
Yeah, so you basically had to show you could elect people in past elections is really what that's trying to measure there. So, turns out the Greens only hit 1 of those 3. They're polling approximately 2% based on what I last saw in the aggregators. The MPs elected gets checked off, but yeah, the big thing is they're only running candidates in about 70% of the ridings. Now they
232 of 343.
Yeah, now they told the debate commission they were going to meet the target there, so that's all a little questionable in how that got. But either way, Tuesday rolls around, and the debate commission comes out and says, yeah, we had initially invited them. They don't meet the requirements anymore, but we're still going to keep them on the stage. Fast forward to the next morning, which was the morning of the French debate, and they've backtracked on that.
Yeah, they uninvited.
It's a mess. They should have just cut them as soon as they knew they didn't meet the requirements.
It was just mean.
Like, if you're going to have
do that
rules
to them. Like, I think it was justified, but
I don't even know if it was
inadvertently mean.
I think
it was incompetent for sure.
Well, the Greens get definitely incompetent. Also, there may be a little bit of the Greens get treated with kid gloves for some reason, mostly because they're not really a serious party. But yeah, if you're going to have a set of rules, if you're going to set up a commission in order to create rules and run a debate, you can't just go throwing the rules out the window the moment it becomes slightly inconvenient.
They then faced calls from the NDP that were echoed by the Bloc to move the French leaders' debate because it was going to interrupt the Habs game. And they did move it. I think the other parties probably agreed, because what's an hour or 2 earlier?
Notably, this was not a game that got thrown together.
Yeah, but it did become
it's been on the schedule.
A game that they could clinch their playoff spot late. And that's why it was an important game.
Come on, you're hosting a debate in Montreal. Don't put it at the same time as the hockey game. It's not hard on this. And yeah, so that was a fail on their part. I've rarely said a positive thing about the NDP this campaign, but I did like that. It actually showed a little spark and energy that has been missing from everything else they've done
Yeah, it was fine.
so far. So, I don't know. Yeah, it was kind of nice to see something that wasn't just rehashing the same policy announcements.
I don't think it
putting
wins
out
anyone
every
any
election.
votes, but it was clever.
Not
Yeah, like
boring
the
the
rest
way
of the
everything
debate.
else has been with them.
So that got changed. And then at the last minute, we hear before the French leaders debate that, Rebel Media will be sending 5 journalists to the post-debate scrum, whereas Post Media is sending 1, and like the Globe is sending 1. And people are like, what?
I think Politico had
Yeah.
2, like, 1 or 2 basically was.
And it wasn't just Rebel, it was also
media
like
got
True
in.
North and Juno News and a bunch of these like far-right bodies show up, and it turns out that they had threatened to sue the commission for trying to keep them out, and they were going to seek an injunction to let them have as many journalists show up as they wanted. And the commission caved and signed an agreement to let them have 5, 1 for each regional bureau of Rebel News. And it went as bad as you can imagine. They got up and asked Mark Carney, how many genders do you believe in? Or do you think there are? He said there are 2 sexes, and kind of otherwise flubbed that answer. They asked Jagmeet Singh, I saw, why doesn't he condemn anti-Christian bigotry when churches are being burned over residential schools that didn't actually bury kids in unmarked graves, was roughly their question. I'm not paraphrasing that much. And he just said, you know what I'm going to say? I don't take answers from far-right news groups or far-right media groups that peddle disinformation. And he just stuck to that line. But luckily, we didn't have a scrum after the English debate, because Ezra Levant got in a verbal fight with, I'm not clear who, I think one of the CBC journalists. And it became a security issue.
Yeah, it was also reported that the debate commission only discovered today that Rebel News is registered as a third-party advertisers for the election. So basically doing election
It's a little different than that. It's that Ezra Levant is director of a second group in addition to Rebel that is a third-party advertiser, and it's one that ran trucks around outside the debates, peddling like anti-immigrant slogans, or I forget exactly what it was on it, but it was like highly charged stuff. But they didn't do a basic like Google to figure out who Ezra Levant is and the kind of shit he does. And so like, oh wow, we didn't know Ezra Levant was, and Ezra Levant was there. You could have excluded him as like not a journalist because he's told a court he's not a journalist in the past, and it's been found. But that was embarrassing for them and Canada, and good job. So
anyway, it was a mess. Nothing on this prep or anything went well. Kind of already given our take on the moderation. Like the actual debate was, other than the weird moderation decisions and format, was okay handle. Like as a technical matter, it all worked, but
it all
format
worked.
left something to be
What
desired.
What a great.
Yeah. Everything else around it kind of didn't, but yeah. So what's the
I think we forgot to say about the format. They also ended with like 80% of the debate was that, random question to each leader, and then an open discussion where it was kind of led by one. But they also then had each leader got to ask another leader a question, and they had 3 minutes for this exchange, except it was more like one person could talk for 3 minutes and then not let the other person answer anything. Which was dumb.
Yeah, they yeah, nobody talked less asking the question than the person responding got to talk responding to it. I think Mark Carney is the most balanced of it, which, he they probably regret slightly because I don't think he actually came out ahead in that exchange, and the other ones just basically got to land their talking points and have a pretty minimal.
And then there was a
rebuttal
final
to them.
section. Yeah.
Except maybe Blanchet,
just had his
who,
usual.
was struggling with. Yeah, was long-winded, but it was also struggling with the language, so I can.
He had his usual fun that he gets to have in the English debate. And then there was a final like lightning round of just like a random question for each of them with 45 seconds. And then they all got asked, what's your biggest regret in this election? And Yves Francois had like a sincere answer, and then the rest just said that we didn't get to meet more people. It sucked, Scott. Yeah. So the debate itself, like I said, Yves Francois Blanchet is very good at these. He got, I think, the best quips. Kind of just got to be chill throughout it. Yeah, exactly.
Well, there's no states.
I don't agree with everything he said, but he says it well.
You did the one that's. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, mostly. Definitely a few times where he blanked on the.
It was either
English
sold
word
or
for something
trafficked.
and
He was trying to get to, but yeah, he struggled there.
Yeah.
That was surprising to me. I thought
a couple of
he
moments like
had a
that,
better
but you know,
English
that's.
grasp. I did like when he said, "I don't usually speak English, or I try to not speak English in Montreal," and also how like a third of his closing remarks were in French. That's enough about him.
Singh, delivered a bunch of the NDP lines.
He tried to be a bit too gimmicky, I found, with his like holding up 6
little
fingers.
Gimmicky.
Polyev, you only built 6 homes, and that's like referring to a weird, obscure answer the Liberals, I think, got from question period one time, and I don't think it's accurate.
Yeah. No, in fact, you actually posted in the Slack, you found a Jenny Kwan, a NDP MP, basically doing a, this is bullshit post on it on her website, which is just hilarious that they then ran with. And yeah, other than that, just spent a lot of time trying to like get in and shout over and talk over, and I came off looking all the poorer for that. It's one thing if you didn't like get in and push the other person to respond to you or like take over the conversation. That rarely happens. It's very tough to do, and I don't think he has the skills for it. Very few people who ever get up on that stage can pull that off effectively. But he did not, and instead it just came looking kind of petty and whatnot, and allowed the two front runners to largely maintain composure and kind of both hit the prime ministerial note.
Singh had a couple that landed, and then a lot that were cringe or awkward or just, like you say, I think he was strong on the stuff he's usually strong on, like healthcare and talking about those kind of issues and climate. He really tried to, he and Blanchet actually both really pushed back, as a weird amount of the debate was spent talking about pipelines and oil projects. And Singh was able to at least call them out on that, sometimes a little bit quippy. I don't know if Polyev hit the prime ministerial note. He definitely churned down the attack doggedness possibly too far at times, especially in the first half. And in his closing remarks started with the like most Mulcair fake smile I've seen in a few debates. But he didn't come off as total asshole. I think he did go back to some of the like base talking points. Like I don't think talking about the notwithstanding clause and a couple of the other issues he brought up, like pipelines even, are going to win him.
Well, he got asked about the notwithstanding clause. Like there wasn't.
They
really
brought it up in the last week.
The weird one.
I think he got asked about
on the
crime,
debate stage,
and then he said he would bring in the notwithstanding clause to lock away people. So they come out in caskets or boxes. Sorry, which, Jesus.
I'm pretty sure Pakin asked about the notwithstanding clause in the opening of that piece, but we'd have to go back and check the video on that. But yeah, the really weird one was the Century Initiative thing that got brought up near the end. Weirder still was that Blanchett introduced it like halfway through the debate, which was
The Century
not what I was
Initiative being
expecting.
the goal of having
For him to
100 million Canadians by 2100. The year.
Yeah, we actually interviewed someone from there a couple years back, so it's probably in our back catalog.
Blanchett's against it because he doesn't know how Quebec will be properly consulted on that. And Polyev kind of played it up as like a conspiracy that Mark Carney's involved in. Cool.
Yeah. It's fine. Like, I think you can point out some pretty fair problems with how the government of the past 10 years, being influenced by some of those ideas, have not necessarily put the requisite work into making sure everything else was scaling up at an appropriate rate to accommodate all the newcomers. But, the basic idea of we should have more people. This is a very big, underpopulated country, and there's a lot of benefits to scale that we should realize. And, particularly in a moment like Canada is in right now, where, a little more hard power and economic oomph would be very welcome. Well, those things both very strongly correlate with population size. So, definitely a place for it. There's a lot of fair critiques we could level at the immigration policy of the last 10 years and some of the stuff around it. But yeah, the basic idea of there should be 100 million people in the country by the end of the century is not a crazy one. Hell, it's not even that big a growth rate if you actually work out the math on how you would get from 42 million to 100 million over 75
but
years.
It scares some people to think about big numbers, so I can get where Polyev and Blanchett were going on that. Overall, it didn't feel to me like Polyev was appealing much beyond the 35 to 40% that seem locked in as conservatives right now. At any point, like, Pakin asks, "Are you still committed to defunding the CBC as one of your first acts?" And he's like, "Yep." And there are conservatives who want the CBC gone. I get that. There's a lot of people who aren't conservatives who don't like that idea. And maybe you need to soften them up a bit. And he tried to talk about the idea of CBC as a, non-profit private news broadcaster, but like, it's pretty obvious it would not exist in the form it does without a substantial amount of the money it gets from the government right now. And, when we're reading stories about the right-wing media fuckery around the debates, and Polyev talking up press freedom in this debate while also not talking to the press through most of the election, or at least not allowing them on his planes and limiting their debates limiting their follow-up questions. And in one instance, at least, his aides getting rough physically with journalists. Yeah, this was out in Atlantic, Canada. I'll put a link in the show notes, but the Conservatives' position on press freedom seems challenging to win over, like, the soft liberal voter.
Yeah, there are definitely a few parts where that were more base targeted. I think every party leader hit that note at one point or another. That's entirely Blanchett's contribution to it. That said, yeah, the conservative one's probably the one that also has the most odds of stopping the tent from growing, from hitting on those. So that, still a problem with him. I think he generally did pretty well on the affordability and security sections, and kind of, as expected, probably not as well on the climate stuff, but I'm not sure how much that one's going to make a big impact. Overall, I'd say he took the rough edges off, which has been probably one of the biggest problems they've had through the whole campaign, is the edges have been much rougher on everything than it needed to be. So being able to deliver the basic points of the campaign in a way that took those edges off, landed some good hits on a bunch of the main points, and particularly the line kept driving the line through the whole thing of tying Carney to the last 10 years of an unpopular liberal government. Generally worked
Although I think
well,
Carney's
I
response
think.
of like, you don't have Trudeau, you don't have the carbon tax, why are you still fighting against those? He kind of kept coming back to that as well. And I think Polyev didn't have a response to it either.
Which worked on the carbon tax specific stuff, but the broader economic stuff, Carney's I wasn't really advising the PM didn't really land well, but on that I think that came off more looking evasive than definitive or getting him out of the connection there. So other than one or two moments, he kept pretty much delivering that point. At no point was there a thorough enough rebuttal to it that would undermine the core point of, yeah, a lot went wrong in the past 10 years, and simply swapping out the guy at the top for an past advisor and keeping everyone else around isn't going to fix anything, was, I think, fairly competently delivered and was a consistent through line through it that may break through.
I'm surprised they didn't go after Carney more for parachuting in or having no experience in politics. And I'm also surprised there was no rebuttal to that ladder that Carney also advised Stephen Harper, but I guess it wasn't in Polyev or Carney's interest to bring that up. I'm surprised Singh didn't bring it up. These are the same guy.
Yeah, although I think Carney would be the only one to try and maybe benefit a little bit from that. Just generally the response of the government to 2008 is generally seen as pretty good, whether from the Bank of Canada or the federal government on that. But yeah, Singh doesn't get anything out of bringing that up. Whereas the Liberals' economic record is decidedly more mixed, and there's definitely more you could take aim with at that, because it's been a pretty lackluster 10 years.
On the American stuff, there was the standard talk of Trump and tariffs, and Carney kind of backed off of dollar-for-dollar tariffs in favor of what I think he did a half-decent job of explaining the strategy they're going for, high impact on the U.S., low impact on Canadian jobs for tariffs and stuff. Everyone else just doesn't have the same levers of power, and so just kind of has to go, we'll be strong. But what I was a little bit disappointed by is it kind of our approach to the U.S. ended there in the discussion. There was a question, I think, to Singh about Arctic sovereignty and can we rely on the U.S.? And he's like, not really, but he doesn't really have a strong answer on what he'd do to respond instead there. But people are being disappeared in the US, right? There are Canadians who have gone to the States and faced harassment and ICE detention, and yet we still have a safe third country agreement, and none of these parties have talked about tearing that up. And there's none of the parties are talking about what do we do to protect Canadians who have to go to the States still. And we're just missing this broader conversation. It's not just in the debate, in the whole election. All of them are kind of stuck on that. I'm just disappointed, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the similar thing where there was some talk about, okay, how do we make Canada stronger? It was very kind of general on there. There was no sure, if we are in a situation where we're going to have to go it a little more on security, what does that actually mean beyond, I think Polyev talked about opening a new base in the north. That's 1% of the puzzle. And, that was more detail than some of the other people offered, but there's still a lot of space on the page you need to fill in on all that, and what's being offered both in the debate and in general is just fallen well short of what a serious plan would be from anyone on that. And I do think a little bit of that is maybe just the how big a change everything is hasn't really sunk in, either to the leaders or the people working on prepping this stuff.
Which is not great for our situation, but yeah, any other takeaways from the debate before we move on? Neither of us. Did you watch the French debate at all?
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
Other stuff going on yesterday, and wasn't able to view that. We didn't really talk about Carney's performance at all. Yeah, on this. There's a bunch of stuff he could critique, like basically looked at the moderator rather than the camera, so it didn't seem like he was making eye contact with people watching it rather than people around him, and some of that just comes to time and whatnot. Definitely went in like the professorial tone or mode quite a few times, which, if you were one of the people looking for stability coming out of this election, that might not be the worst thing. Although there wasn't as much contrast with the Conservatives based on how the Conservatives showed up to this one on that, so I don't think they got a lot out of that because they didn't have the that contrast point there. And some of the debating skills weren't up to where the other ones were. On the leader gets to ask one other person a question, Carney went with the security clearance thing, and then wasn't really able to land that, like got the question out, but the rebuttal to that, and then that got turned around on the, if you really care about foreign interference, why didn't you get rid of Paul Chain after he suggested that a Canadian who's an opposition candidate should get disappeared to China on there, and came out looking the worst for that exchange. And I think a better debater would have been able to bring that more to a tie or come out ahead.
He also ran out of time. He was at that point about to turn it back to India and alleged influence. I don't know if he was going to say India outright, but alleged influence in the Conservative campaign. So there was a rebuttal there, but the format kind of killed it. I think Carney was fine. He wasn't dynamic or charismatic, but he wasn't, flubbing anything. There was a few points, like when Polyev asked him in his long, rambly, just about 2-minute question, which started as a campaign speech, and ended with like, "Won't you look at the camera and apologize for inflation?" And basically advising, like, apologize to Canadians for the inflation crisis we've had for the last 2 years. Just like, it's not a question, dude. And Carney just kind of like scoffs and goes, I forget his actual answer, but it seemed like fine, because at some point, I don't know, you just can't take that guy seriously when he's in that mode. You can't take Polyev seriously. And so I think he held his own. He didn't lose his cool.
I'm a little curious to see what the how that's going to play for the people who've not been like as tuned in and have been paying attention to how much of this was domestic policy versus global structural issues in the economy post-COVID and whatnot.
You can have that, but if your real question is, why don't you look in the camera and apologize to anyone? That's the part. Like, I think the question was valid, Scott, but the actual question was bullshit.
The scoff thing, though, the scoff bit could come across as dismissive, not just of the "will you apologize" bit, but of the underlying economic pain that was at the emotional heart of the question.
I think if Polyev hadn't asked it like an asshole, the exchange, he wouldn't have scoffed, right? And I think it's not hard to see that tone that he came out of that question with. And the fact that, I mean, maybe people won't see the 2-minute long campaign speech he started that with that seemed to be just rambling, which was definitely the worst of the questions. Like, Singh, I don't think realized you could just talk for 2 minutes. Blanchette did. And then Polyev was like, oh, we don't even need a question? Oh, I guess I have to get to something. Do you deny eating babies, sir? Yeah, I'm curious how the post-debate discussion wraps up. I worry it's just all going to be like about rebel news instead.
There'll definitely be a certain amount of that, and particularly because one of the pathologies of the media is the media really likes talking about the media and process stories, and this is both of those. So that could, definitely overtake.
Well, I mean, like...
that for sure.
Yeah, the debate commission lost the debate.
Yes. As did a lot of people watching it. But in terms of the overall, like, what's the impact of this gonna be? Blanchette he has nothing to gain, nothing to lose from this. Irrelevant. Singh, I don't know, maybe convinced one or two fence sitters on some of the Brookfield stuff or whatever, that, Carney's not looking out for them, but
probably not losing votes over it, not probably gaining much.
Yeah, but he needed to gain, and he didn't out of this, so that's a loss. I think between the got rid of the rough edges and kept very focused on trying to bring the question back to the Liberal record, Polyev helped himself, but not enough to fundamentally change the structure of the race, and Carney didn't take a knockout blow, so that's good enough for the front runner.
That and Polyev leaning back into conservative hobby horses, like pulling out the notwithstanding clause, defunding the CBC, and going all in on pipelines without a climate plan.
I'm not sure he came out looking bad on the crime debate on that one, but yeah, the CBC one I think could potentially
He
hurt.
can talk tough on crime without pulling out the notwithstanding clause. There's a lot of people, especially women, who don't want to lose abortion rights, who don't like hearing that being mentioned, even if they could maybe see the point on this, which I don't think many is worth it. It's the nuclear option for like 4 people.
I mean, keeping mass murderers in jail is not a slippery slope to get rid of abortion.
No, pulling the notwithstanding clause from not being used federally into being used federally is.
Yeah, to overrule or to reassert Parliament's role in setting criminal law after a completely ridiculous Supreme Court decision that way overstepped the bounds on that one.
They're still in jail and will be as long as, minimum 25 years, likely life. Life sentences are still life sentences. It's just there needs to be some chance of parole because prisoners, like it or not, have rights too, Scott.
Yeah, but that doesn't...
And saying they should leave in boxes is fucking horrendous. That is capricious bullshit.
There's no reason why someone who, in cold blood, walked into a mosque and murdered 6 people out of pure hatred should get out of jail anytime in their life, and let alone have the 5 murders that happened after the first one just not count at all. That is just dismissive.
Just call for the death penalty.
Even a life sentence is not the death penalty, and it's a ridiculous comparison to say that...
No, saying he should leave prison in a box is saying you want the death penalty.
You just said he's not likely to get out of jail, so that's just the same thing, in a just slightly nicer package.
He could reform. It saves the chance. Our justice system is predicated in part upon the hope of retribution and rehabilitation.
Yeah, that is one of the points in the criminal code of what the purpose of sentencing is. There is also...
And he wants to abolish that.
No.
In this case.
No, that's one of the points. There is also incapacitation, removing the person from society so they can't harm others. There is denunciation. There is deterrence. All of those are valid sentencing goals. And it is entirely reasonable, and not just reasonable, the proper purview of the democratically elected parliament, not an unaccountable judiciary, to assign the relative importance in the broad scale on what should be considered when sentencing. That should be the decision of Parliament. It's up to the judges to interpret how that then gets applied to a specific case. But the 4 people who commit multiple first-degree murders, we want to prioritize more the incapacitation, the denunciation, and the deterrence aspect is an entirely appropriate thing for the democratically elected parliament to do, and it should not be the case where an unelected 9 people just get to decide that instead of an accountable parliament on that is then accountable to the people. There's going to be a lot.
If we can overrule that right, why can't we overrule any other right? That's what it comes back to.
It's not a right. There's no right to not.
It is a right. No, it's a right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment.
Having a life sentence for committing mass murder is not cruel and unusual, and it's a ridiculous suggestion to think it is.
He still gets a life sentence with the 25 years minimum.
Yeah, which is the same sentence as if he had just committed 1 murder, which effectively
and guess what? When his parole comes up, they're going to consider it strongly.
It denies the harm that he caused to the other 5 victims there. There should not be a sentence.
And here's the fun, Scott. When Polyev is arguing this on stage, he's losing.
I am not sure that keeping someone
notwithstanding clause brought in.
I'm not sure that keeping someone who committed
except Blanchette. Blanchette did.
Keeping a mass murderer in jail is not something that's going to be politically losing on that. And
pulling the notwithstanding clause is.
Maybe, but this is very clear. But in this case, the court got it wrong. It was a dumb, ridiculous ruling that was in part based on the absurd suggestion that having sequential parole ineligibilities, basically sequential sentences for this, would somehow undermine Canadians' faith in the justice system. An assertion the court just made up here. They provided no evidence for it. The survey evidence we do have of Canadians' opinions of the justice system suggests, if anything, they think that it is too lax on criminals. And if the court is going to be, if we're going to decide what proper sentencing regimes are based on what is, or what helps or hurts the public's perception of the justice system and its validity, that is politics. That is the aggregation of all the different views of Canadians, and that is a political question that should be reflected in Parliament. That's not for the court to decide. That's not anything they have skills in determining. And if they're going to basically make political decisions, which that is, the proper thing for Parliament to do is say, no, that's out of your scope. You should not be doing that. And it's our responsibility to reassert parliamentary prerogatives on this.
I just don't get the political strategy of dropping we should overrule the court's decision for political reasons, as you say, amid a broader debate in the US about the government there just disregarding the court for political bad ones reasons in the same time. Like, the comparisons are immediately obvious to many. And I get you don't like the decision, but that's not universal. And there's a lot of lawyers and people who study human rights and criminal code issues who are very happy to see this, right? Who don't think like you. You can moralize the argument as much as you want, but it is not necessarily the very fact that there's one. And dropping
the very fact that there's a disagreement here means that it is a political discussion. It's a political question, and that makes the proper view.
I know that some of the founders, I know some of the drafters of the notwithstanding clause did think it should only be used in non-controversial situations.
I bet if you polled on the question of should someone who commits 6 murders get no additional sentence for the last 5 of those, there would be pretty much nobody who would agree with that in the country. Like, it would be almost entirely non-controversial.
I mean, it depends. If you think, you can ask any question in a way, I should say, that you can get that answer. And I could also rearrange the question to say, hey, should someone have the chance at rehabilitation in prison? People like that idea and are going to say yes. And as soon as you've said, no, you're in jail for 600 years or whatever, guaranteed to die in there, that eliminates that chance at rehabilitation. That's why it's cruel and unusual punishment. We don't have the death penalty in this country.
Yeah, no, it's just
some people actually do want it, but
to sentence someone to life for that.
Court disagrees, but let's continue on. We've finished on the debates. Let's talk about the other story that came out this week. I think we'll have to skip the policy. That was our policy discussion. The rest of it was boring, except for the Liberals Canada Strong pass, where you can go to parks and have your kids ride Via Rail for free. But just this summer. It's mediocre. Anyway, the Liberals crashed the Conservative conference, the Strong and Free Network conference, and made weird Trump-style buttons. It was just like a couple staffers. It's unclear what role they had, but they were in the central war room, and they tried to embarrass the Conservatives in the most awkward way, and they were caught out bragging about it in front of a journalist that they were aware of at their table at the bar after. Someone went, "Hi, I'm a journalist." They went, "That's cool. Anyway, let's keep talking about all this stupid shit we did."
Yeah.
This is embarrassing.
It's embarrassing. It's bad on so many levels. Here, obviously they were trying to mess around, cause mayhem, and yeah, certain amount of that happens in politics, but, it shouldn't. And when people are caught for it, there should be, firings and stuff rather than waiting a couple days and then, just reassigning them on this. Which is what Carney ended up ultimately doing. I have trouble seeing how this doesn't rise to a firing offense, but, then again, neither did suggesting to haul off opposition candidates to disappear them to authoritarian countries. So, that candidate resigned himself a few days later rather than being summarily fired like they should have. So, not great leadership from Carney on a few different fronts on this during the campaign.
Resigning yourself can sometimes be a non-optional situation. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, but it should not have been.
There.
It should not have been on day 4 of that.
The response here was not great. Initially, they had a statement out a few hours after, kind of went all over the place and suggested things just got out of hand. And then the next day, he kind of admitted it was staffers, and yeah, they were reassigned. It's unclear where.
Yeah, that first one really had the air of statement by committee trying to avoid anything that admits wrongdoing.
It's awkward things have happened.
Yeah.
And if they did, we didn't know about it and didn't mean it and are sorry you're offended.
But yeah. Also, this is the party that has put a lot of emphasis into the politics of fighting misinformation. They love to wrap themselves in the we're fighting misinformation flag. Every opportunity they can get, and yet they're doing stuff like this. It's just incredibly hypocritical on that front. And
I will say it feels like young staffers doing something stupid. This doesn't feel like a real strategy, right? Maybe it was, in which case that's extra embarrassing. But the vibe I got was young, early 20s, thought this would be funny, and then were bragging about it at the bar after when they had too much to drink.
Yeah, but like if you really disapprove of them for doing that, you
I agree. They should be
fire
fired.
them. And like if it doesn't raise that, there's like a degree of condoning it for just reassigning. That is we were sorry we were caught, not we were sorry we did it.
But the story kind of went away because the debate became such a clusterfuck of its own. But yeah, what a weird little bump in the road for the Liberals that was entirely self-inflicted. Speaking of self-inflicted, is the Conservatives are still struggling in Abbotsford, where Mike DeYoung, independent, has now earned the endorsement of outgoing Conservative MP Ed Fast, who slams his party in a CBC interview. And it also seems like it's pointed out that the Conservative candidate there isn't campaigning.
That's interesting.
I don't know what's going on. Yeah. Anyway, I hope Mike DeYoung likes being politically useless.
Oh, I know.
Going from
if
he can talk to Jody Wilson-Raybould about what use independent is.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if he gets welcomed back in the tent after that. Particularly if there's
Will he want to be?
I don't know. If there's a shake-up and like there's a change in leadership, I could definitely see that. Which, if you throw a 20-point lead and lose, there's very decent chance of on it.
So yeah, I'll be watching that race on election night.
Yeah, that whole thing's just an unforced error on the Conservatives' part.
And since we brought it back to BC riding, let's close with a couple stories that did come up in BC this week. The legislature's sitting. We have 3 new government bills. One is a very dry justice or whatever, attorney general reform bill that just does a bunch of cleanup. I didn't notice anything substantive in there. We're also getting 2 more substantive changes to the Employment Standards Act. Sick notes will now be effectively banned, except in extreme cases, which will be up to the minister to decide in regulation, as is tradition in this province. Good bill, in my opinion. Saves healthcare time, lets people just stay home if they need to and get better. And we are shaking up the Motor Vehicle Act by eliminating the second road test that you would get at the end of your graduated license. And so once you have your N, you just kind of automatically get a full license after a fixed amount of time. The government says statistics and evidence show the second road test isn't necessary. I'm curious to see that data.
Yeah, I don't. I'm
not fully skeptical, but
I'm a little skeptical on that. Like, if anything, in North America, it is too easy to get a driver's license. There are some European countries that take this a lot more seriously and make it tougher to pass. And just the rate of motor vehicle deaths, well, lower in Canada than the US, is still fairly high and would not be a bad thing to require a higher level of proficiency from drivers in general, and particularly the newly licensed. So,
I think it might fundamentally...
Think back to my time in high school, it was much more common to fail the L to N test than to fail the one at the end of the N for the general license. But even so, just in general, this is a move in the wrong direction towards having a higher expectation of drivers.
I think you're right, and I think I agree. I mean, I think it's probably partially driven by an overstretched ICBC driver licensing system where they don't have enough staff to handle the tests that are being asked of them. And here's a way to reduce that backlog. Thinking back to when I was in high school in Alberta, you could get a learner's license at 14 and a full license at 16 with one road test. They did bring in graduated licensing a year or two after I got my full license, but
I'm just gonna...
your learners only took passing it was like a 10 question true or false
I think
test.
mine was like 30 to get the learners.
Maybe it was 30.
Anyway, consider the reputation Alberta drivers have. I'm not necessarily convinced that
No, that's not a good system.
Going that way is a good thing.
I think the government points out there's only one other province, Ontario, that requires that second road test. But yeah, I think wrong direction. The other story that came out this week from Rob Shaw is something big is happening at the BC Health Ministry, where there were a massive amount of firings this week, with apparently grief counselors being brought in. It was that big of a shakeup. We haven't had any government releases. I didn't actually see anyone else covering it. So there's more stories to be heard there. I know the NDP campaigned on what sounded like some boring reviews of how the health ministry is governed and making it more efficient and streamlining things. And a couple months ago, there was some talk about shakeups at like Fraser Health's board and changing the CEO and stuff like that. But whatever's happening right now in terms of the shakeup seems substantive, to say the least. TBD if it's good or bad.
Yeah, well, considering how many problems there've been in the healthcare system, just doing basic stuff like having ERs be open, I'm hopeful that there's only up to go.
Firing a lot of people often makes it harder to run things, but if they're as part of a broader reorg that helps it be more streamlined, efficient, and keeps things open and has more money to do it.
Yeah, and if it lets them reallocate from administrators to frontline personnel, that should also be quite useful, depending on how much bloat there is in the system.
So it's something I hope more journalists are able to keep an eye on. I need to poke around at that, but yeah, it's something. It's something. It feels like the government hasn't like put out a press release to tell us what they're doing yet. We'll find out.
And that has been Politicos. Find links to everything we talked about at politicos.ca. Support the show and get access to our exclusive Slack channel at patreon.com/politicos. Our intro music is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikov. Politicos is a production of Leg and Boot Media. Audio editing provided by Jesse Woodward at listener-supported CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Learn more at chly.ca.